there are certain percentages that you should be able to do in your head, mental math. 10% and 1% are two of those percentages. So what I'm going to show you is how do we do this with our calculator? How do we do percent of? Because this is how we say it in English. What is 10% of 32? That's how we say it, but how do we do it mathematically? What would we type into our calculator? Because last I checked, there wasn't an of button on my calculator. So we're going to see how do we do this on our calculator, and then we're going to see how do we do this without our calculator. So whenever you see the word a percentage of with our calculator, we change our percent either to a fraction or a decimal. So I'm going to change it to a decimal right now. Do we remember how to change a percent to a decimal? How do we change 10% to... So we're going to, 10% is the same as decimal 10. Because 10% is the same as 10 over 100. And when you have a fraction over 100, you'd move the decimal place back 2 spaces. So it's decimal 10. You could write it just as decimal 1 if you'd like. Now, a percentage of, 10% of, that means once we change it to a fraction or a decimal, we'd go 0.10 and then times. Because a percentage of is multiplication. 10% of 32 would be 0.1 times 32. So you can change your percentage to a decimal, or it would be fine to change your percent to a fraction and times it by 32 as well. So you would type either one of those into your calculator, and once you've typed it into your calculator, either way that you do it, you're going to get 3.2. Yes?
I had a different way.
Okay.
What I did was I got 10, and then there's a percent button, so
Okay.
I did that, and then I pressed the multiply button on 32, and I came up with the same answer.
Perfect. So on some calculators, they allow you to put the percent in, and there's a button for percent, and then times it by 32. Perfect. But you still have to know that the word of means that we're multiplying. So that's a key thing. What is 10% of or 25% of? Whenever you see that written that way, now you know that that means multiplication. Now 10% and 1% are ones that I want you to be able to do without your calculator. So when I see 10% of 32, anytime, by the way, it'd be like 32 and there'd be a decimal place right there, even though you don't write it. Anytime you're doing 10%, you're just going to move that decimal place over one spot. And so 10% of 32 will be 3.2. 10% of 54 would be 5.4. 10% of 103 would be 10.3. So that decimal place is just moved one spot over. So that's how you do 10%. For 1%, again, you've got your calculator. When you're changing a percent to a decimal, you move the decimal place 2 over, so this becomes 0.01. We've got the word of here, 1% of, so we're going to multiply by 125. Or you could have made it a fraction and done 1 over 100. and multiplied it by 125. Or if your calculator has a percent button, you could type that in as well. So if you have your calculator out, you should try that. You should try to see if you've got a percent button. You should try to see if you could type it in correctly to get the answer. Yeah. And no matter which one of these that you do, you're going to get 1.25 as your answer. So if 10% move that decimal place over once, 10% of 125 would be 12.5. Mental math-wise, just doing it without your calculator, 1% moves it over twice. So for both 1% and 10%, those are the quick ways that you can figure things out. Now here's two for you to try. Here's the first one. And 10% of 50? 5. So you move the decimal over once, you get 5. 1% of 42? 0.42. Move the decimal place over twice, and you would get 0.42. Yes? 10% you just move it over once, and 1% you move it over twice. But whenever you get values that are other than that, that's where you might want to go to your calculator. I'm going to show you how to do this one with mental math as well, but here we want to find 20% of 15. So in our calculator, I'm going to change 20% to a decimal, 0.20. I'm going to times that because it says of, 20% of 15. And I type that into my calculator, and I get 3. So if you were buying something for $15 and there was a big sign above it that said 20% off, that means you would save $3. Not a lot, but every little bit helps. If you wanted to do this without your calculator, can you see that 20% is the same as 10% plus 10%? Two 10%. And 10% of 15, I guess I don't need that extra 0 there, but if I'm thinking money, we move the decimal place over once, we get 1.5 or $1.50. So 20% would be 2 of those, and 150 plus 150 would make $3. So you can do other percents if you'd like with mental math. In fact, you can do any of them. If someone wanted to find 13%, well, that's a 10% plus a 1% plus a 1% plus a 1%. And all of those ones you can do without your calculator, and then you just have to add them up to find out your total. Why might 13% be one that you would want to figure out? Because of taxes. So you could figure out how much your item was going to cost roughly with taxes. And if you had only cash, then you'd find out whether or not you have enough. So you don't go to the till and they're like, you don't have enough money. And then that's sucks. Embarrassing or just sucks because you're like, oh. So 3% of 400. Again, calculator. I like this one because when you change 3% to a decimal, it's 0.03. So that's an important thing because some people, you see 3 and you want to change it to decimal and just go 0.3. So that's a common mistake that people make. And then times that by 400. And you're going to get, put that into your calculator, you're going to get 12. Okay? So all of these ones that aren't 1 and 10 would be expected that you could use your calculator. If you wanted to figure this out, 3% is just 1% plus 1% plus 1%. And 1% of 400, if you move the decimal over twice, is 4. So if you had 3 of those, 3 times 4 is 12. So now you can figure out all sorts of percents if you'd like. 32% of 200. Try it with your calculator and try it on your own. How many people don't have a calculator here? Okay, so you have to do it the mental math way if you don't have a calculator here. You have your phone, which has a calculator on it. 0.32 times 200. Did you get 64 on your calculator? Awesome. If you did it mental math, you might have said to yourself, well, 32% is going to be 10% plus 10% plus 10% plus 1% plus 1%. So I have 3 10%, and 10% of 200 is 20. Can I just write 3 times 20? Are you okay with that? Or would you like me to write 20 plus 20 plus 20 under each 10? Well, that's what makes most sense for you. Because there's 3 10%, so I went 3 times 20, because 10% was 20. And there's 2 1%, and 1% would be moving that decimal over twice, which is 2. 3 times 20 is 60, 2 times 2 is 4, 60 plus 4 is 64.